I can hear you perfect.
All right. Ready on set? Quiet on set.
Well, welcome. We've learned something today. We're going to meet with one of our favorite sons from D.C., but we've learned that if we could just turn Congress's schedule over to Miss Emily, that it would run on time and we'd have it down to each minute.
This is true.
Joe, if somebody doesn't know you, why don't we start with an intro?
Hey, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. It's
Good to have
always
you.
a pleasure, always a pleasure. Joe Kennedy, I'm the congressman from the 4th District of Massachusetts. Includes areas just outside of Boston, all the way down south and west to the Rhode Island border and down to Fall River. It's my first term, I'm about 18 months or so in, and it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to represent the people of the 4th District in Massachusetts in Washington, D.C. So
Now,
thank you for having me back.
Great to always see you in Milford.
Oh,
Do they
always.
look at you still as a first-timer? It's 18 months.
It's a very long freshman term. It's a very long freshman term. I think that's probably one of the reasons why they have it as a 2-year term, just so they can prolong that freshman period. You know, it's been one of the, I know we've talked about this before, but it's been one of the great surprises and privileges of being in Congress is the vast majority of my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, are really good and decent people that are working really hard, that are genuinely trying to do what they think is the right thing for their own districts and their own constituents and the country. And we're going to disagree on some of what that is. The right economic policies for rural North Dakota or Texas or Oklahoma aren't necessarily going to be the same ones that drive the economy in Milford or Greater Boston or the South Coast region. And that's fine, we understand that. The question is how are you able to work with your colleagues to tackle some of these challenges, to build a consensus around some policies that are what everybody across the country, or most people across the country, can come to agreement on and will move the country forward. And that part's been a little bit harder than it probably was intended to be, but it was never supposed to be easy. And working with a number of my colleagues, again, both sides of the aisle, has been, that part's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, you know, you think of the era of Reagan and another homeboy, Tip O'Neill, where I wouldn't say their politics were well aligned, but yet you saw a mutual respect there, that, you know, they would be at each other's throats publicly, the cameras go off, and they could have a drink together.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Are we getting closer to more purple people versus dead red and dead blue?
I think, look, it's one of the big challenges we have out there today for a wide variety of complexities that are driving that process, where you've got a more polarized dynamic in Washington, D.C. I think if you look at the country is divided on some big ticket items, but there's actually quite a bit of consensus on even some of those challenging, polarizing issues, and some of the smaller pieces. There's most folks that I talk to, whether they be progressive Democrats or fairly conservative Republicans, will actually say, look, I'll disagree with you on one aspect of this, but I really want, we want the process to work and we want it to work better. I'll compromise with you some way. Even if it's saying, this part of tax reform or immigration reform is really important to me, I will compromise on that aspect, but I'm willing to give you some aspect of another piece of it. And so, again, the challenge for the rest of us is to try to find a way to navigate through that, through some of those obstacles that we've got. Understanding that if you come at it with good faith, if you come at it based on conditions that you're seeing back in your district, that there are going to be ways that people are willing to compromise with you. And it doesn't mean you're going to get everybody to agree with you all the time, but you also don't have to. We have to get to 218 votes, half plus one. And you know, the more you dig down into some of these local issues, I think the more consensus you're actually able to find. And so we've been really trying to do that over the course of the past 18 months, and I think so far so good.
Well, I mean, when you think about so many issues that Massachusetts has led the country on, you know, this whole polarization.
Yeah.
I I'm one of the purple people here who, I'm not.
Wearing a blue shirt, though. So
Well, there you
appreciate
go.
that. Thank you.
I had to do that for you. I couldn't resist. But you know, you think about it and you say, okay, physically I'm too conservative to be considered a Democrat. But I'm socially aware, so I can't be a Republican. So you're sort of sitting in the middle where I say red and blue, I'm kind of purple in the middle. And I kind of like it.
Look, I think that a big percentage of the country is actually in that middle and there's aspects of the Democratic Party that they agree with, there's aspects of the Republican Party they agree with. And the challenge that we've seen down in Washington is that unfortunately, we've got a dynamic, particularly in the House, where we're not able to come to an agreement on some big issues and find a consensus. And again, that's not to say you're going to agree with everybody all the time, but there are probably some ways that you can get to the requisite number of 218, that number of votes. Immigration reform, I think, is one of those where if you actually were able to work through a compromise bill, you could get 218 votes for that today. We're hung up on that, and that's a challenge. It's disappointing. If you'd asked me a year ago if we would have done it, I would have said yes. But you still can't take no for an answer. We've got to find a way to work through it, whether it's immigration reform or tax reform. Some of the challenges out there with healthcare, ways that we can try to find a way to strengthen and bolster our economy. Some of the challenges we're seeing with foreign policy. There's no shortage of issues to work on. There's no shortage of talented, dedicated people in Washington. The question is how can you, again, dive down into those issues, build up some trust and respect and credibility with your colleagues, and then turn that over to basically say, in good faith, let me work with you, understanding that we're not going to agree on everything. And you and I aren't going to agree on everything, but you know what? If you sit down and actually try to work it through, you'd be surprised at how much you can come to some sort of consensus.
But you come back to the O'Neill-Reagan era of, I don't have to love you, I don't have to hate you, but if I have respect for what you're trying to do, we can work together.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, you went away for the weekend.
I did. It was a bit further away than I was initially anticipating. So just got back from Latin America, left on Friday afternoon on a congressional trip. It was led by a Republican from Oklahoma, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats from all across the country, a couple from Georgia, Republicans from Georgia, Democrat from Texas. The chairman of the trip was, again, James Lankford from Oklahoma, Republican, another Democrat from Delaware. So very bipartisan. Left Friday night, went to El Salvador, then Honduras and Guatemala, returned back on Monday
You're taking
evening.
on an issue that, for me, is one of the hardest things. Because in the abstract, I know how I can talk about the logic and the logic trail, but then when you look at the little faces, it seems like everything changes.
You know, it was, we all had done our homework before getting on a plane and heading down to El Salvador, aware of the complexities of this issue in particular, so the unaccompanied alien children that are arriving on our border, predominantly from those 3 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And the challenge that poses to our immigration system and trying to figure out how to deal with it. So it's a complex series of factors. We had done our homework going down there before we got there. I don't think any of us realized how difficult and how challenging an issue this actually is that has no easy and quick answer. And I think if you take a step back for a second and actually think about it, just as you said, you start to realize that the decision for a family to either go with your young children or to send your child by yourself, or himself or herself, with somebody that you don't know, a coyote as they're called, a smuggler, thousands of miles away through very dangerous territory, the areas that are controlled by gangs and cartels, some of the most violent areas in the world, to show up at the border and with the hopes that you're going to find a way to get a better life. That decision to send your child on their own is an extraordinarily personal one. It's one that's mired in the individual decision by that family.
No, but think about it. You come from a family that's fairly close-knit. Yep. You know, we'd think you're Portuguese if it wasn't for the red hair, but you know, I always was in awe of my grandfather, who, forget the danger, but he left 3 daughters behind in Portugal, came here, worked his buns off, never spent a penny, because every penny he could went back, and once a year got to fly home and see his daughters. I mean, I can't imagine a harder decision, you know, especially from families who are very close, to take your children and say, I may never see you again. I'm not going to see you for years.
And that's the decision, unfortunately, that so many of these families are having to make, because as you go through, San Pedro Sula in Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world. It's about 190 murders per 100,000 people. The United States, as a country, we're at about 4.8.
I was going to say, my Lord.
4.8 versus 190. There was a woman in my office week before last who told me the story of her fleeing Guatemala, I believe it was. Gun put to her head a number of times. Her entire family threatened the car that she was in. She'd worked. She's from El Salvador, excuse me. She had worked basically selling street food. Car she was in was shot up by one of the gangs. She had tried to come to the United States, had gotten as far as the border once, had actually gotten detained in Mexico once. The final straw for her that made her come this third and final time was a note that she got from the gangs that controlled the area where she lived, which said, "You must pay a war tax or your youngest son will pay it for you." And so with that, after having guns pulled on her entire family, after being shot at, after that note, she took her youngest son and fled. That's some part of the challenges we're up against. And it's also the recognition that there is no quick and easy answer to this.
I mean, if you look at the dogma. You know, I know how to stop it. The Great Wall of Arizona. Build a 20-foot high wall.
Yeah.
You know, nobody can scale it from California to Texas, and nobody will get in. I just can't imagine that as I'm putting that last brick in, and I see that little face, so that you know that little kid could pay with her life. I don't know how I wouldn't grab the little kid and bring her over the wall.
Well, so that's also what's so fascinating about this challenge, particularly with these young kids, is that they're not trying to scale a wall. They're not smuggling through a tunnel. They're not crossing in a desert. They're showing up to Customs and Border Patrol, our Department of Homeland Security officials there, and saying, "Here I am. Come save me. Come take me," and turning themselves in.
Whether it's an armed guard or a 20-foot wall, you got a little kid saying, "Mr. Joe, help me."
And so the big challenge here, I think, if you're, again, able to step back from it, you got to look at this comprehensively. So first, it's going to be trying to, which the United States government is already doing, but trying to make some investments in these countries to increase the rule of law. 90% of the murders in Honduras go unprosecuted. Not just acquitted, but unprosecuted. There is an impunity there because no one has faith in the police force. So there's very few institutions of the state that are actually strong enough, in El Salvador as well, to actually provide for the safety and security of these families. So it's working with international partners, trying to increase opportunity in some of these countries through some investments, trying to work with host country governments to increase the ability of police, to try to stabilize the situation on the ground and build up some economic growth. That's one aspect of it. Another is, yes, streamlining some of the processes that we have here in the deportation, in the immigration process, I should say. There's various bureaucratic hurdles that we can actually try to remove and to just make that go far more effectively and efficiently working with our counterparts in these host countries. The Salvadoran government just built and opened a consulate on the border in Texas because of the time lapse, the lack that it was taking for them to get some papers that were needed by our government in order to process some of these deportations, not of the children, but of the adults. So there's some things that we can do there to just speed up the bureaucratic process. So that's another aspect of it. Third, this is a clarion call for comprehensive immigration reform. And it's a complicated issue. As you know, the Senate has already passed a massive comprehensive bill that deals with many of these issues here. We need to work on this in the House. We need to get, at the very least, some aspect of this before on the House floor, and so that we can vote on it. And more than anything, when we're down there, you heard either from our host country, our government officials on the ground, or host country officials, and even folks that have been traveling the fact that tried to immigrate, the fact that the smugglers, the coyotes as they're called, are using the misinformation and oftentimes deliberate misinformation about comprehensive immigration reform as one of the reasons to confuse people and say, oh no, the policy is that if you show up, you're in.
Right.
The last piece to this that I think is actually critical, that often doesn't get talked about, is that instability that exists in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. And the inability and effectiveness of governments to actually provide basic services, particularly safety and security. That is driven mostly by the drug trade. And that is now with the success of Plan Colombia and Plan Merida in Mexico, many of those drug traffickers have set up shop at Honduras. That drug interdiction efforts in Honduras alone cost that country about $110 million a year. That's $110 million they're not able to spend on their own people. All of this is demand driven by the United States. And that's just one country alone in Honduras. You look at El Salvador,
$100 million to an economy like Honduras
is very big money. And so as long as that demand exists in the United States, I spoke with DEA officials because this is something that we're dealing with, particularly with regard in the 4th District, particularly with regards to the heroin trade and opiates, the recent scourge of opiate overdoses we've seen in Massachusetts and across the country. DEA officials estimated that the opiate trade with Mexico alone was $40 to $70 billion a year. The GDP of El Salvador is about $18 billion a year.
Say half.
Half. That's the order of magnitude that you're looking at. If you don't address the drug addiction issues and start to focus on treatment and prevention here in the United States, whatever we do elsewhere, you're not changing the underlying conditions that are sparking this need for people more than anything else.
Symptoms, not the disease.
More than anything else, looking for a way to provide a better life for their children.
Now, what do you say? You know, one side we laugh saying can't build a 20-foot wall. The other side says if you make the border totally open, you're just going to encourage everybody to come over and we can't absorb them. How do you address that side?
So I think that was one of the great aspects of this trip. Again, 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. We got along very well. We represent very different parts of the country, very different constituencies. We all went down, we had done our homework. They asked, the Republicans on the trip had asked some very serious questions, and I think as you get exposed to the complexities of this, on the one hand, that poses a challenge. On the other hand, it poses an opportunity because there's no silver bullet to this. There's no one lever you can flip and say, hey, this is going to solve this problem. And you get back to the moral aspect of the fact that when push comes to shove, these are kids that are looking for a way to provide for their own safety and security, and families, parents, that are willing to risk their own safety and security and the safety and security of their children in order to get to the United States because they believe that is going to provide that safety that they're looking for. So there's actually a fair amount of ability to work together on this, and I was impressed with my colleagues, again, both sides of the aisle, that with the seriousness with which they address this issue and the large-scale consensus that we had, at least identifying some of the factors and, if not agreement on all of the solutions, trying to say, okay, well, here's one piece of it that we think we can work on. Here's another piece of it that we think we can work on.
There is no magic bullet.
There is. There's nothing that you're going to be able to do, wave a magic wand and say, this problem's solved. Push comes to shove. Again, the driving factor in all of this is the belief that for these families and their children, that there is the future for them living in Honduras and El Salvador in particular is very, very bleak. And until you solve that problem, you're going to see people continuing to go to try to provide some
we
form
had
of
it
safety.
when my grandfather, I mean, he came
And
to,
mine.
and yours,
And mine.
they came here, not out of safety, but for the fact that the economic conditions were such that they couldn't provide as well for their family. I can't imagine if you took our murder rate and upped it 24-fold, what that would be like to live there. You know, I've always said we can talk about international policy, but if my daughter can't walk down the street of Milford without me worrying about her survival, I hate to say it, but I don't want to look past the center of the universe, which is my family in Milford.
Right. And look, that's the crux of it. Again, we can talk about international policy, and much has been made about that, about per capita incomes and about economic growth and about safety and security. But when push comes to shove to this, and again, this part was brought home in our discussions with folks that had tried to cross the border, had been detained and had been sent home, with family members, with officials in these countries. This is a very personal decision that every family is going to make because they know the risks, they know how dangerous it is. I talked to one individual who had was apprehended, an older gentleman apprehended crossing through a desert in Texas. He said there's no way he would try again. He was at one point basically detained by a Mexican cartel that they were mired in a gunfight. Four members of the cartel were killed. He said it was so dangerous he would never want to risk this again. There were others in that same group that said that their future was so bleak that they would be willing to try again.
Let's bring it closer to home.
Yeah.
16 months ago, you came on the show and said that one of your big priorities was manufacturing jobs.
Yes.
Okay. 18 months have gone by. What have you done?
We're working on it. So thank you. So we just came, we were over at Thermo Fisher about an hour ago, had a wonderful visit there, looking at some of the aspects of the opportunities that particularly Metro West offers for manufacturing. Had a couple of companies that came by as well, talked a little bit about why they are centered here and their opportunities. And interestingly, they pointed to a couple of things over and over and over again, a number of these companies. One was the fact, just location, the fact that they were close to Boston but not in Boston. Standard of cost of living was much lower. Standard of living was excellent. That they had access to extraordinary talent that were coming out of our community colleges and vocational schools, but also the schools that are around Greater Boston, that they could just, whenever they were looking for that either top-end talent that they're from the PhD level down to the folks coming that they need from the trade skills from a community college or vocational schools, that they had tremendous access to that talent and that ability. And many of them are expanding. And they luckily at this point haven't had trouble finding and replacing some of those jobs. Some of them have for specific skill sets, but they all said that the access to talent here in this region is second to none, literally anywhere in the world. One company said that they had moved people back from California because the skill set here was so high that they didn't even have the ability to find the quality of those workers even in California. So we've had a number of meetings like this. We're going down to Fall River tomorrow, and then we'll be in Needham with another group of manufacturers on Friday. So we've done meetings like this and roundtables like this all over the district over the course of the past 18 months and even before that on our campaign. So that I can make sure that as we take a step back and look at what some of the factors that are driving the Massachusetts economy and particularly 4th District, it's driven by small businesses, this district is, and a big percentage of those businesses are small and mid-sized manufacturers that are providing and creating some extraordinary pieces that go into some of the best technologies anywhere in the world, and they ship anywhere in the world. So how do we retain them, how do we cultivate them, and how does federal policy at the very least not get in the way? And to that end, we've crafted a number of different pieces of legislation down in Washington, everything from STEM education to trying to get more women and minorities, low-income families involved in STEM fields, to actually creating big manufacturing centers of innovation that the president even spoke about in the last State of the Union, to tackle the next big challenge and the next big thing in manufacturing technology, and creating these centers all over the country. And so we hope to actually pass that, yes, pass it out of the House next week when we get back. It's already passed that out of our committee. We've got, you'll love this, we've got 99 co-sponsors on the bill.
I was going to say, isn't this one of those things that is purple?
Yes, it is purple. It's been a great lesson. It's good policy. And what we were able to do over the course of the past 18 months, we filed the bill about a year ago. We looked at, our team go district by district across the country and look at the districts that had the biggest manufacturing base, identify who the biggest employers were, what the biggest trade groups were, reach out to them, ask for their input, and then ask for their support. And that let us go around to, in conjunction with Tom Reed, who's our Republican lead, he's a Republican from upstate New York, and the chair of the House Manufacturing Caucus, to work with him and to basically go district by district and say, hey, here's a bill that I think you might want to support. But this isn't just a good national policy. This is something that your district wants and your district needs. And your district actually is already, some of the employers in your district are already behind. And that let us get a lot more Republican support off the bat than I think people were expecting. Congressman Reed's done a great job shepherding this through Republican leadership, and we were able to get it out of our committee just before we left on recess. 99 co-sponsors, evenly split Democrats and
I'm going
Republicans.
to say strategically brilliant. When you got 100 votes, I'm assuming that as a co-sponsor,
One would hope.
we can
Yes.
count on your vote.
Yes, that's the
So
idea.
it's kind of like, okay, guys, we need you to bring a buddy.
Yeah.
Go find one other congressman that you trade or whatever you do with. Well, you're at 198, so you need 20 extra.
We're, it's the benefit of after you get some momentum with a number of these legislation, that starts to steamroll. And in the past couple of weeks, particularly as Congressman Reed was able to shepherd it through Republican leadership, we were able to reach out to some Democrats and Republican colleagues to, again, make sure it was balanced. More and more people started to be excited about the bill. It started to get some great talk down in Washington. So we're optimistic it's going to get in the House floor in September. It's got great support in the Senate already. It's passed out of their committee by voice vote as well, Senate Commerce Committee. It's being led by bipartisan support there, Senator Sherrod Brown and Roy Blunt, two folks from the Midwest. So you've got Northeast support in the House, you've got Midwest support in the Senate. Hopefully we'll be able to find a way to get this done. And again, it's been a priority of the president, but really more than anything, a good piece of policy to try to breathe, to make sure that the United States, the federal policy, is forward enough looking to understand that yes, manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing, does have a future here. Groups that we just talked to yesterday said when it comes to the intellectual property, the prime, the crown jewels of our company, we're going to keep that here because we've got rule of law, we've got access to courts, we know that it's not going to go overseas and get stolen as it does in some other countries. And you've got the access to that talent base to really bring, to drive that new innovation and then bring it to the market. So,
You know, it's funny because we saw a lot in the biotech side, and that's important
Yeah.
to us, going over to China, India, because, you know, an FTE, a full-time equivalent there could be 120 grand, 130 grand, versus here, 250. But over the last few years, I'm seeing more and more of the smaller projects starting to come home because people are starting to understand if you're a Pfizer and you can negotiate for 300 FTEs, you've got the infrastructure. But when you try and do smaller projects like most of our little biotechs do, the inconvenience of trying to deal with somebody who's, you know, instead of driving to Cambridge,
yeah,
I got to fly 18 hours.
it's a long trip.
You know, and we're seeing more and more of those projects that initially it was kind of in style to send over. And we're seeing them come back. Are you feeling that?
Absolutely. So we are seeing them come back, and that's one of the reasons why we're trying to capitalize on it. And Massachusetts, I think, is strategically positioned to really capture a great chunk of, again, this advanced manufacturing market. And the biggest aspect of it that manufacturers and employers talk to me about is, again, that access to talent. Because if it's the manufacturing is, hey, we're going to make it mass produce the cheapest widget, they can do that in China. They know how to do it. They can do it in other parts of the world. That's not our strategic advantage. Our strategic advantage is the medical device manufacturing. It is that top of line, it's sensors, it's aspects that go into the highest end products, the highest end testing products in the entire world. What goes into your knee, your heart valve, stuff that can't fail and has to be accurate to the millionth of an inch. And we can do that here, and we can actually do it very well. And because people are willing to pay for quality, that potentially that little bit of a cost increase that you're paying here, they can pass that on to their consumer. Because I had one big company, EMC, told me, said, look, when it comes to our crown jewels, when it comes to data storage and folks that want to make sure that their data is protected, people are willing to pay a little bit extra to ensure that quality is done and it's done right. I liken it to if you're offered a parachute, right? Are you going to take the cheapest option, or are you willing to spend a couple bucks more for one that you know is going to work? Most folks will spend a couple bucks more to make sure that they got something that they know is going to
when you think
help.
about it too, you know, a parachute.
Yeah.
What was good in World War II, the big bubbles, you don't really think as acceptable in today's day and age. When I look at things like what we're involved with, synthetic organs. No, making a cheaper trachea really has never come to our discussion at a management level, but having the ability to maintain the innovation that once we have a trachea, how do we, again, not stop, but how do we do the research to even improve it further?
Absolutely. And so I think a big part of this, and again, what people have talked to me about and industry leaders have talked to me about, is the importance of creating that ecosystem around it. So we've done the Life Science Initiative from Governor Patrick that I think has been tremendously successful in luring biotech, biopharma particularly here to Massachusetts. Not just is it because there's some state support for it, but it's because you've got the innovation here, you've got little guys here, you've got bigger guys here. That is attracting an entire ecosystem around biotechnology and biopharmaceuticals. There's the potential to try to do that as well with and compete worldwide with that top level advanced manufacturing. You've got to put the same pieces in place, but you're seeing, at least talking to employers, you've got that access to talent, which is the biggest piece about it. We're now, through some of our STEM efforts in science, technology, engineering, and math, trying to work with industry to make sure that that transition also is done in their minds as well, that they look at access to talent as a supply chain issue as well, and not just something that, oh, we can find some smart person someplace else. Well, if you're going to headquarter here in Massachusetts, it's going to be because we are going to provide you that access to the most highly trained, most highly skilled workforce that you have. And the only way we can do that is if we have a very clear understanding from industry as to what skill sets they want, what they need, and what they're going to need 2, 3, 4 years out. And that coordination has to be as tight as we possibly can get. And that's really where we need their help. And where STEM Council that Governor Patrick and Lieutenant Governor Murray had started up is the strategic vision for that. We just brought on Jeffrey Leiden to be the honorary co-chair with me, and he's really leading those business outreach efforts to try to make sure that businesses is engaged in this as we need them to be successful.
And you think about it, one of the most important aspects is the internship program.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, where any small biotech is silly not to take on 2 interns a year, because they pay up to $7,500, so you can fund an entire summer. And it really does give these kids experience and a taste of different positions.
So it's the experience, it's the taste of the different position. It's also the training ground such that for that company, it lets you understand who's got the talent, who's got the work ethic, who's got the ability to come in and actually be trained up on the skill set that you need and you value as a business. And so one of the other areas we're working towards and working with is through particular community colleges and vocational schools and some of the smaller, again, manufacturing businesses that say, look, one of the biggest costs we have is training an employee, and we can't, our new employees can't necessarily afford to take an unpaid internship for months. We can't afford to pay them to not be as productive as they otherwise would be as a full-time employee. So can we work through a partnership with a community college or a vocational school to give them course credit for an internship where they can get the class credit that they need in order to graduate, the business benefits because they're actually able to get that additional worker, but don't necessarily have to compensate them as a full-time employee. And the student is going to benefit because you're actually building the skill that's going to get you right into that job when that job opens up.
And it works.
And it works. And so, and that's a role where the federal government, I think, and state government can help convene and can help put that model together. But it isn't one where we're saying, hey, more additional regulation or some additional government mandate to say you have to do X, Y, or Z. It's just convening and putting the pieces together to make sure those incentives are aligned to help support business and industry.
We took on 2 interns this year. Both of them now have full-time positions with us.
That's great.
You know, they came in, one was a chemist, one was a biologist. They worked hard, they got the experience, and when open positions came up, they already know my company, they already know my products. Why wouldn't I hire them?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we're seeing that model, and it's something that we are hearing from companies, again, some big and some, particularly some small, of saying there's a great partnership here if we can try to find a way to put those pieces together in
But
ways
does
that
that
fit.
happen outside of Massachusetts? I've not heard
Let's hope
that
not.
initiative.
Let's hope not. It is happening. There's some places that are very good at it. Raleigh-Durham is very good at it. Research Triangle there, they've made a big bet on that aspect too. And look, if Massachusetts is going to compete, we want to be the best in the world at it. And so that means we're going to have to go up against the best in the world. And it's something that I have no doubt. If you look at the people that are, the companies we've got here, the commitment that we have from industry, and the fact that I think the politicians, state, federal, local level, all understand how important this is, we can do this and we can do it really well.
So 18 months in, are you feeling that we're getting closer to working together as red and blue?
You know, I think, yes, I think it is. I think, again, some of the challenge at those big, most polarized issues, it is still difficult. But one thing that I've learned is if you can break some of those issues down to a local issue, you can put a human face on it. You can talk to people about how this is important to the constituents in their district. You will find common ground, and you will find people that are willing to work with you. You're not going to get everybody, and you're not going to get the same person all the time. But it does mean, I was elected by the people of the 4th District, and I hope to be again in November. My views are no less legitimate than any other of my colleagues, but their views are just as legitimate as mine as well. And I think if you're able to spend some time with them, I've done a lot of outreach to my colleagues across the aisle, to other Democrats as well. Sit down with them, get to know them, understand that we might not agree on everything, but if I sit down with you for a meal, I will find something that I agree with you on. Almost everybody, if you can't agree on tax reform and immigration reform, and you can't say you're going to love the Red Sox, you at least can say you're going to root against the Yankees, right?
There you go.
You'll find
common.
and you can build it back up piece by piece from there.
So as we end up, an election's coming up.
Yep.
When we have candidates on, we ask one fundamental question. So here's your chance for a commercial to our 6 loyal viewers. I'm from Milford. Why should I vote for you?
I appreciate the question. First, thanks for having me on again, as always. I want your vote, I want your support, and I want your respect, because I am fighting each and every day for the people of Milford and the people of the 4th District of Massachusetts and our state to try to make sure that every single day our government in Washington is responding to the needs of our local constituents, and to try to do what we can to make our pathway a little bit better and a little bit brighter. We're not going to agree on everything all the time, but you certainly have my commitment that no one's going to work harder, no one's going to be more accessible to their constituents, and no one's going to try to take your story and your conditions and your challenges and understand how the federal government can support them, how we can try to remove some of those roadblocks, and at the very least not get in your way as you're trying to build a better life for you and your family. And that's my commitment, and hopefully that will help me win your support in November and September.
And thank you for always being around Milford.
Thank you. Really a pleasure.
And as always, thank you for joining. I hope you've gotten a little bit of a perspective of 18 months in. And hopefully the next 18 months will be as productive or more so. So as always, may God bless. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for coming on.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Not too long since I've been